The bag sits on the shelf behind the glass counter, a crisp $40 sack of synthetic fertilizer with a smiling tomato on the front. And what it's missing is everything that actually feeds your soil. Notice this: the rich gardeners who buy those bags won't tell you what a 70-year-old man does with a bucket of kitchen scraps, because they don't want you to know that his entire fertilizer budget for the year comes to $0. By the time this investigation closes, you'll know exactly how to turn the waste from your own kitchen into a fertilizer that makes your neighbor's plants look like they're being paid to perform without spending a single coin. Here's the hard truth that's been sitting in your trash can every single morning. The most powerful fertilizer on this street isn't in a shiny bag. It's in your coffee filter and your eggshell carton and the peel you just threw away without a second thought. The chemical companies spent generations convincing you that feeding your garden requires their factory-made powders, their blue crystals, their precise blends measured to the gram. But there's a gardener in Texas, 70 years old, who's been growing tomatoes that dwarf anything in the garden centers using scraps the rich gardeners would never touch. And he's been doing it for decades while they've been buying bag after bag. Here's the trap, and I need you to hear this clearly. If you just bury a banana peel whole in the soil like so many online gurus tell you, you'll attract every ant within 50 meters. You'll get a sour stink rising from the dirt, and your plant will rot instead of thrive. And if you pour fresh coffee grounds straight onto your seedlings, you can burn those young roots so badly they curl up and die within a week. Most people try kitchen scraps once, do it wrong, watch their plant suffer, and then swear off the whole approach forever, which is exactly what the fertilizer industry wants you to do. But the old gardener from Texas has a different way, and it starts with something you're throwing away right now. You know that moment when you spent $20 on a bag of so-called premium fertilizer, followed the instructions to the letter, and watched your tomato leaves still turn yellow and curl at the edges? That's the feeling that the garden just hates you, that you're doing something wrong, that maybe you need to spend even more money on an even fancier product. I've stood in that exact spot, dirt under my nails, staring at a wilted plant that refused every expensive thing I gave it. And then I watched how this 70-year-old gardener fed his soil with nothing but kitchen waste, and I realized the whole industry had been selling me the opposite of what my plants actually needed. You just saw the trap. Bury a whole banana peel, you get ants and rot. Dump fresh coffee grounds, you burn the roots. I'm about to show you the method the fertilizer industry counts on you never finding. So subscribe now and stay on this case. Then type James in the comments if you want to see exactly how that 70-year-old Texan has been feeding his soil with nothing but trash for more than 40 years. The old man's name is James, and he's been gardening on the same patch of Texas clay for more than 4 decades, stubbornly refusing to buy a single bag of synthetic fertilizer since the late 70s. His neighbors call him eccentric, the garden center guys call him outdated, and the agronomists would call his methods backward if they ever bothered to look. But here's the thing, nobody can argue with. His tomato vines climb taller than his fence, his pepper plants groan under the weight of their fruit, and every single one of those plants is fed by scraps that the rest of the neighborhood throws in the trash. When I asked him why he never caved and bought the expensive stuff, he just laughed and said, "Why would I pay for what my kitchen already gives me for free?" The central contradiction is impossible to ignore. The experts insist you need their tested, manufactured, precise fertilizers, while James's garden, unfertilized, unmeasured, unorthodox, produces results that embarrass the chemically fed plots down the street. For 40 years, the official advice has been to reach for the bag, while James has been quietly proving that food waste, prepared correctly, outperforms everything the stores sold him. So which one is actually right? That's the loop I'm about to close, and it starts with what you're going to do tomorrow morning. But not the way you think, and definitely not the way the internet tells you. The first step is all about drying, and it's the step that keeps most people from ever succeeding with kitchen scraps. Take your used coffee grounds from this morning's filter and spread them thin on a baking sheet, not in a thick clump, but a single even layer, like you're seasoning something delicate. Leave them on the counter for a full day, sometimes two if the air is humid, until they turn from that dark, wet sludge into a crumbly, sand-like texture that slips through your fingers like fine gravel. The change is unmistakable. The glossy black clumps become dull, the weight drops by more than half, and the smell shifts from bitter coffee to something almost neutral and earthy. Now crush your dried eggshells the same way, but this time you'll notice the difference immediately. The crack and crunch under your fingers, the sharp edges giving way to fine powder, the way the shell's inner membrane peels away like tissue paper. A rolling pin or the bottom of a heavy glass works perfectly, and you're aiming for pieces no bigger than a grain of rice, small enough to break down quickly in the soil, but textured enough to still hold air pockets. Your hands will smell faintly of mineral and limestone, that dry alkaline scent that tells you these shells are carrying calcium your plants are starving for. This is the preparation that takes 10 minutes and costs absolutely nothing, and it's the difference between feeding your soil and just leaving trash on top of it. The drying and crushing. That's the moment the evidence takes shape in your hands, when the grounds go from wet sludge to grainy sand and the shells crack into mineral fragments you can feel against your fingertips. Subscribe right now, because what comes next on this channel isn't theory. It's the documented case files of scraps that outperform every blue crystal on the shelf. And you don't want to miss the next investigation. Drop the word ammunition in the comments if you've ever crushed those shells and sensed, without anyone telling you, that you were holding something your plants were begging for. Here's where most gardeners quit, and I want you to notice that pause before you give up on this whole idea. They see how simple the drying is, how little work it takes, and they assume it can't possibly be enough. But that's the conditioning talking. That voice that says, if it's cheap and simple it can't work, that you need the complicated blue crystals and the measuring scoop. The truth is that James has been doing exactly this for 4 decades, drying the grounds, crushing the shells, never once measuring anything beyond a rough handful, and his soil has gotten richer every single year. The secret was never complicated. It was just buried under a pile of marketing. Tomorrow morning, before the sun gets high, you'll take those dried grounds and those crushed shells out to your garden, and this is where the application gets its own careful logic. You never dig them deep, never bury them in a pit, never mix them into the bottom of a planting hole. You work them into the top 2 inches of soil, gently, like you're folding them into the earth's surface, rather than hiding them away. The texture does something important. Those fine grounds hold moisture and release nitrogen slowly, while the shell fragments create tiny channels for air and water to move through. You'll notice the soil darkens where you've worked it in, and when you run your fingers through it, you'll feel the grit of shell and the softness of coffee blended together. You still with me? Good, because this next part is the real secret, and it's where 90% of homemade fertilizer attempts go wrong. You do not apply this all at once, in a thick, heavy layer, no matter how eager your plants look. You feed in thin applications, about a handful per plant, spaced out over weeks. letting each dose break down and release before the next one goes in. This is why the old gardener never burns his plants, while the internet's one-time dumping method leaves yellow scorched leaves and stalled growth. James treats his scraps like a slow drip of nutrition, not a flood, and his plants respond by growing steadily instead of spiking and crashing. Call back to what you felt this morning when you spread those grounds on the baking sheet. That dry, crumbly texture that took a day to achieve, because that patience is exactly what the soil needs now. Fresh grounds dumped straight into the garden create a different story entirely. They mat together, turn slimy, develop that sour fermented smell, and actually temporarily lock up nitrogen while they decompose. But dried grounds, worked into the topsoil in thin layers, release their nutrients over weeks in exactly the rhythm a growing plant craves. When you water them in, you'll see the water darken as it picks up the coffee's richness, carrying it down through the shell fragments into the root zone. The tension is building now because everything you've done so far has been preparation. Quiet, patient, unglamorous. And you might be wondering when the payoff actually arrives. That's the moment the whole thing hinges on, the moment that separates the gardeners who trust the process from the ones who bail out after 3 weeks of seeing nothing dramatic happen. Because that's exactly when the plants start to change, and if you've been watching closely, you'll catch the first signal that something is working underground. The leaves don't just stay green. They start deepening, darkening, taking on that rich, glossy chlorophyll glow that you only see on plants that are genuinely thriving. And then the proof arrives, the kind that makes the rich gardener's jaws tighten when they walk past your fence. The stems stiffen, thicken, hold the plant upright with an almost defiant rigidity. And the new growth comes in faster and stronger than anything the chemically fed plants can manage. The smell of the soil shifts too. Instead of that sharp chemical residue that clings to synthetic fed beds, your earth gives off that deep, sweet, humus aroma. The smell of a forest floor after rain. The smell of life breaking down and rebuilding itself at the same time. That's what a real fertilizer should be doing. Not just dumping nutrients, but building a soil that feeds itself. That shift in the soil, when the chemical residue gives way to that deep humus aroma, is the moment the case closes. The evidence is in, and it's incontrovertible. Subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation, because there's another kitchen scrap sitting on my counter right now that the industry doesn't want you to understand. Tell me in the comments, when did you first smell that change in your own soil? Describe that exact moment, what you noticed first, because I read every report like it's new testimony. The neighbor across the fence will eventually ask, that muffled, "How did you do that?" delivered with a mix of envy and disbelief, and you'll be standing there with your hands smelling of coffee and crushed shell, knowing that the answer cost you nothing but a week of mornings. This is the moment that James has been living for 40 years. The moment the industry would rather you never experience because it breaks the entire loop of buying, applying, and buying again. The synthetic fertilizer companies don't want you to know that your kitchen can outproduce their factories because that knowledge makes their entire model obsolete. But here's where I have to be honest with you, because this is the part that every internet guru skips. There's a trap waiting for you if you ignore the details. And it's the same trap that makes most people abandon this method within a month. If you skip the drying, if you bury the peel whole, if you pour fresh coffee straight onto seedlings, you will not get a thriving garden. You'll get ants and rot, and that sour stench of failure that convinces you the whole idea was nonsense. The method works because of the preparation, not in spite of it. And the moment you get careless is the moment your plants pay for it. The old gardener's secret was never magic, And it was never even really a secret. It was decades of stubborn trial and error that taught him which errors to avoid. He learned the hard way that fresh grounds burn, that whole peels attract pests, that impatience kills more plants than any deficiency ever will. And those lessons, paid for with years of blistered leaves and ant-infested beds, are exactly what you're getting for free right now, without having to make a single one of those mistakes yourself. Imagine your tomato plants 3 weeks from now, standing tall in the morning sun, leaves so dark and glossy, they almost look polished. Thick stems holding fruit that's already starting to ripen early. Imagine the soil at your feet, dark and crumbly and alive, releasing that sweet humus smell every time you water it. The earthworms working their way through the coffee and shell you fed them. That's what a $0 fertilizer buys you, if you're patient enough to dry the grounds and crush the shells and apply them thin and slow, the way James has done for 4 decades.
Let's see what you can tell me.
And in the next investigation, we're putting banana peels on trial. That potassium-rich skin that everyone swears by, but almost nobody prepares correctly. The one that attracts every ant in the neighborhood when used the way the internet recommends. You think you know how to use a banana peel? James thinks differently, and his pepper plants have an opinion that 5-minute search results can't match. You'll want to see what happens when we put that yellow scrap under the same forensic lens.